Thank you all for being here today. Naturally, I'd like to begin by thanking my gracious and generous hosts and sponsors here at Oxford, the Queen's College, the Rothermere American Institute, the Harmsworth family, and the History Department. It is a joy and honor to be with you here today. So I'm a historian of the US in the 19th century, and one of the central fascinations of studying that era is parsing its expressive political lexicon to recover the meaning of words in their context. The American political vocabulary in our Victorian age was provocative and unrestrained, and seems at first listen to be rather familiar. But as we tune in closely, we discern that the fighting words of the 19th century were laden with distinct, historically bounded meanings. Take, for example, the word disunion, about which I wrote an entire book. It's almost completely disappeared from American parlance, but in the 19th century, it was a fraught and ubiquitous political keyword, signifying all of the many threats to the fragile young American republic, or union, so-called. For decades, disunion was hurled as an accusation by Southern enslavers at Northern reformers, warning them not to agitate the volatile issue of slavery. Only as enslavers lost their control over American politics in the prelude to our Civil War did they transmute disunion into a prophecy, transmute it into their own program of secession. So once Southerners formed an independent confederacy in 1861, Northerners mobilized against secession with their own key word. Northerners fought our Civil War in the name of deliverance, to disenthrall the Southern masses from the sway of the secessionist elite as they saw it. After Union victory in 1865, a new set of keywords, Reconstruction, Restoration, Reconciliation, signified the competing agendas of that turbulent era. Reconstruction connoted transformative change in the South. Restoration, with its strong allusions to British history, connoted the reinstatement of the Southern elite. And reconciliation, the uneasy final settlement in which whites in both the North and South disavowed radical change. So today I will provide an etymology of a phrase that would seem on the face of it to have as starkly obvious a meaning and as ubiquitous a presence as any in American politics, the phrase white supremacy. I will demonstrate that the phrase has its own contingent history, that it first became a staple of American discourse during Reconstruction, and that it entered the lexicon along with a cognate phrase, Negro supremacy, upon which it depended for its propagandistic force. Opponents of Reconstruction explicitly recast American race relations as a contest for supremacy, with an emphasis on that word per se, and they did so in order to invoke images of politics as combat, as warfare. They did so in order to summon violence against African Americans. For the enemies of change, Negro supremacy signified the threat posed by black voting after the Civil War, and white supremacy as a slogan was invoked to herald victory over that threat. The ascendance of discourses of racial supremacy in American politics was a partisan development, driven by the Democratic Party as it did electoral battle with the Republican Party in the era 1867 to 1871, and a careful analysis of the charges and countercharges that flew back and forth between the two parties reveals the extent of opposition to black voting in America. It reveals the limits of the egalitarianism of the Republican Party. And it reveals, perhaps most importantly and interestingly, the rhetorical dilemmas and strategies of black activists in the long freedom struggle. The very language of racial supremacy was, I will suggest, a kind of discursive trap, is a trap, from which Americans have found it impossible to extricate themselves. So let me set the stage with some broad context from the early 19th century. The phrases white supremacy and, quote, Negro supremacy, unquote, appeared only sporadically in American politics before our Civil War. Other linguistic markers of racism, references to racial superiority or domination, were far more common. The language of supremacy was first introduced in the 1850s by Northern Democrats as they confronted a new rival, the Republican Party. I should note that these labels didn't mean back then what they mean now. The Democratic Party back then was dominated by Southern enslavers in league with some pro-slavery Northerners, while the Republican Party, the party of Abraham Lincoln, was a new anti-slavery coalition with its base of support in the free states. The Republicans opposed the extension of Southern slavery into new territories, and they hoped that by containing the institution, they could set it on a path to extinction. So starting the mid-1850s, Democrats, such as a wildly influential New York newspaper editor named John Van Every, began to explicitly style themselves the champions of white supremacy, to use that phrase. And they did so in order to cast the Republicans' agenda as a dire threat to white prerogatives. Invoking Caribbean societies such as Haiti and Jamaica as cautionary tales, Northern Democrats began to deploy the phrase Negro supremacy in this same era to conjure images of a post-abolition world in which the racial hierarchy was turned upside down. Southern enslavers, for their part, appreciated this support from Northerners, from their fellow Democrats, but failed to be reassured by it. As the Republican Party gained ascendancy in the North, the more populous of the two sections, Southern secessionists argued that the Democratic Party could no longer protect slavery against this looming Republican threat, and that the South must therefore leave the Union. The secession of 11 Southern states after Lincoln was elected as a Republican president galvanized Northerners to defend their Union. But these Northern divisions over the issue of race, to which I've just alluded, persisted. During our Civil War, a faction of so-called peace Democrats in the North opposed Abraham Lincoln's leadership, opposed his Emancipation Proclamation. After the Union's victory in the war, Northern Democrats rejoined really with Southern Democrats, ex-Confederates, in a bid to restore the Union as it was, as they put it, to hold the line against any radical transformation in American politics. So the stage is set, if you will. I'll move to the main plot line here. The centerpiece of the Democratic Party's post-Civil War propaganda, as it sought to hold the line against change, was the phrase Negro supremacy. It was nothing less than an incantation used to cast a spell of racial fear and animus, used to conjure anti-Black violence. And the fearmonger in chief, I'm sorry to report, was none other than the new American president, Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was a rare bird. He was a white Southern Unionist who opposed secession and supported the Northern war effort and accepted emancipation as a war measure. And for that bold stance, he was made Lincoln's running mate in 1864 as Lincoln ran for re-election during the Civil War. The thought was that Johnson could attract war Democrats, conservatives, to Lincoln's coalition. Well, the choice looked like a very poor one after Lincoln was assassinated in 1865. Johnson, his vice president, became president, and Johnson revealed very quickly his core conservatism on the issue of race. He reverted to type as a Southern Democrat, which is what he had been initially. As president, Johnson instituted a series of disastrous policies. He showed excessive leniency to the defeated Confederates. He pardoned thousands of them, permitting them to resume control over the Southern states after the Civil War. And this resurgent Southern leadership class, through punitive laws called Black Codes and through relentless anti-Black terrorism, imposed on the freed people, former slaves, a subordinate status, a forced labor system reminiscent of slavery. Andrew Johnson was, most everyone agrees, one of America's worst presidents, but he was also, alas, one of its most influential for the pernicious power of his ideas. he revived a zero-sum game philosophy of race relations that Lincoln had challenged. Lincoln had justified emancipation as broadly beneficial to all Americans. And Lincoln had even, in his last days, signaled that he would support black voting, the enfranchisement of black Union veterans. Johnson, when he became president, succeeding Lincoln, rejected Lincoln's idealistic defense of black freedom as something that would enhance the freedom of all Americans. Johnson defined black freedom narrowly as the right to work for wages, but not the right to a political voice. So when the Republican-controlled US Congress took steps to promote and extend black civil rights, President Johnson accused Congress of imposing, quote, Negro supremacy, unquote, on the South. Now, at the heart of Johnson's war with Congress, which resulted in his impeachment and nearly in his removal from office, was the issue of black voting. In March of 1867, the US Congress passed its ambitious Reconstruction Acts, meant to hit the reset button, as we might say, to invalidate the Johnsonian state governments, Johnson's disastrous policies. Congress's program placed the former Confederate states under military control. Congress enfranchised black men in the South and specified the steps that a new loyal electorate in each state would have to take, such as drafting new constitutions, before those states could rejoin the Union. President Johnson, in response, lashed out against this congressional program. He used his bully pulpit to condemn it. He declared that its manifest purpose was to grant blacks, quote, political privileges torn from white men, torn from white men. Black voters, Johnson fumed, would, quote, govern with reference only to their own interests and create such a tyranny as this continent has never yet witnessed. So as Johnson and the Democrats mobilized against Reconstruction, the term Negro supremacy metastasized in American politics. And our modern day ability to keyword search vast databases of digitized newspapers and thus measure the frequency with which certain words appear reveals a striking development. In the year 1866, the phrase Negro supremacy appeared only 25 times in the thousands and thousands of pages of digitized newspapers on the site newspapers.com. In the year 1867, the year congressional Reconstruction was initiated, that number jumped from 25 to 1,923. And the number more than doubled again in 1868 to 4,584. Notably, references to Negro supremacy far outnumbered references to white supremacy as catchphrases and slogans at this juncture. So why? What's going on here? Well, in a cynical strategy of misinformation, Democrats were overstating black voters' numbers and also misrepresenting their intentions. Democrats were trying to equate black voting with Negro supremacy with race war. In the fall of 1867, for example, the influential propagandist George Fitzhugh of Virginia described newly enfranchised black voters as, quote, burning with desire to begin the fight, the war of the races, at once. He predicted that black voters would refuse to cast any votes for whites, and that once they had elected their own, they would massacre thousands of white men, women, and children, as he put it. So how could Democrats like Fitzhugh reconcile such images of black domination with their bedrock claims the party had staked decades and decades ago, their bedrock claims of black inferiority? They tore a page from the playbook of pre-war enslavers who had grappled with a similar conundrum. The challenge for pre-war enslavers of reconciling their defense of slavery as benign with their deep fear of slave rebellion. Enslavers had tried to harmonize those positions by claiming that the enslaved were submissive and content unless they had been manipulated into disaffection, into malice by scheming outsiders, abolitionists. In a similar tack, Democrats after the war argued that blacks were uninterested in and incapable of self-government unless they had been manipulated by outsiders, now radical Republicans. Revealingly, those whites who were willing to ally with blacks were labeled mongrels by the Democratic Party to brand them as traitors to the white race. The Republican Party was the, quote, mongrel disunion, destructive, centralizing Negro worshipers, unquote, as a Democratic paper in West Virginia put it in 1867. So with this rhetoric of supremacy, the Democrats had thrown down a gauntlet, if you will. How were Republicans to respond? Well, the plot thickens. This Democratic supremacy rhetoric proved to be, for Republicans, a sort of confounding challenge to refute it. And I'll suggest over the course of this lecture that the Republicans failed to meet the challenge, that they failed to realize just what a pernicious and powerful force this Democratic rhetoric was. The initial impulse of Republicans was to belittle the Democratic tactics, to dismiss them, wave off talk of Negro supremacy as a bugbear or myth, as the veriest phantom ever conjured up by a morbid imagination, as one Republican paper put it. Republican leaders, important men, senators like Lyman Trumbull and Oliver Morton, offered an empirical reality check with which to answer the Democrats' hue and cry about Negro supremacy. These Republicans repeatedly noted that Negro supremacy was a statistical impossibility. Blacks made up 5 million of the 35 million inhabitants of the United States. 5 million of 35 million. They were outnumbered 2-to-1 overall, even in the former Confederate states. Republicans pointed out, too, that when it came time to put Congress's program into effect, to elect delegates to conventions that would redraft Southern state constitutions, black voters proved themselves perfectly willing and even inclined to vote for white delegates. Only one state convention, that of South Carolina, had a black majority. Now, this Republican line of argument, this empirical rebuttal, if you will, was demonstrably factual. African Americans were and they would remain an underrepresented minority in political offices during congressional Reconstruction. Blacks were not in control of the state governments at any time, anywhere in the South. This fact, however, mattered little in the Democrats' calculus, and here's why. The Democrats' hue and cry about Negro supremacy signaled much more than a fear of black electoral majorities. It signaled an unwillingness to accept any black political participation whatsoever. And this was dramatized in the election of 1868, that presidential campaign, quite a bitter one, which pitted the Republican nominee, U.S. Grant, against a Democrat named Horatio Seymour. Grant, you may recognize that name, was the Union's greatest military hero, and a moderate Republican who, like Lincoln, had undergone a sort of political evolution during the war and come to embrace emancipation. Grant was disgusted by Andrew Johnson's divisiveness, and Grant came to endorse black voting as the means to secure the peace, safeguard the Union's victory. The Democrats, for their part, passed over Andrew Johnson, who was damaged goods essentially, and nominated a former New York governor named Horatio Seymour, who had been an outspoken wartime critic of Lincoln. Looking to persuade Northern voters in this 1868 presidential campaign that the voting of black Southerners was an existential threat to Northern prerogatives, the Democrats argued that any Republican votes cast by blacks would cancel out the Democratic votes cast by whites and thus effectively disfranchise those whites. As Maryland's Governor Thomas Swan put it, the balance of power would be thrown into black hands as white ballots were, quote unquote, neutralized. In order to discredit the Republican nominee Grant, the Union's greatest hero, Democrats argued that he had been mongrelized, their word. Such rhetoric was not subtle. For example, in an anecdote in a Pennsylvania newspaper, we see an apocryphal story that goes as follows. A one-legged veteran, according to this story, who kept a portrait of Grant in his shop, began to put a black mark on Grant's face every time Grant gave new proof of his readiness to support the infamous schemes of Congress. One line was traced after another, the story went, until now the face of Grant is almost as black as that of any member of a Southern convention. This anecdote suggested the mongrelized Grant had forfeited his very whiteness by supporting the Republican Reconstruction agenda. At its most vitriolic, Democratic campaign rhetoric in 1868 traded openly in threats. We tell you plainly, if we are defeated by the Negro votes of the South, there will be another war sooner than you think, warned the La Crosse Democrat, a paper in Wisconsin in the northern states. Take your choice, white supremacy or another war. That was the paper's message. Now, how Republicans responded to this escalation in 1868 reveals a great deal about that party's coalitional nature. The new Republican governments that were installed under Congress's guidelines in the southern states consisted of three elements: white northern transplants to the South, many of whom were Union veterans; white Southerners, some wartime Unionists, but some converted ex-Confederates too; and black Southerners, newly enfranchised, hoping to establish their citizen rights. This was an uneasy alliance in this coalition, as these three elements frequently worked at cross purposes. Whites in the coalition were interested primarily in economic development and in political power, not in racial equality or the aspirations of the freed people. Reflecting these tensions, congressional Reconstruction, this experiment in interracial democracy which Congress's program had initiated, was, and I quote here the great historian Eric Foner, an incongruous mixture of idealism and political expediency, a mixture of idealism and expediency. The idealistic case for black suffrage was that African Americans deserved full citizenship as a human right, as a natural right, as a birthright, as a reward for their many forms of patriotic service, most notably as Union soldiers. The expedient case was that white Republicans needed black Southern votes to retain control of the government. The tension between these approaches, the idealism and the expedience, was on full display in Grant's 1868 presidential campaign. White Republicans continued to dismiss talk of Negro supremacy as a mere phantom, and they went out of their way to reassure white voters that the immutable superiority of whites, that their own racial solidarity guaranteed their continued domination. At the Republican National Convention in May of 1868, Joseph Brown, one of these converted Confederates, told the assembled delegates, quote, "I belong to the white race and I would sustain no policy that put any other race over my race in the South. We have the advantage," he went on, "in property, education, and political experience." And thus, his point here was to reassure his auditors that, and thus, even under Republican rule, whites would continue to control the South as they always had. They had all the advantages, as he put it. Now, this defensive line of argument was meant to appeal to white voters across the broad political spectrum in the North. But here we come now to the heart of the matter. It signally failed to confront the very real, lethal effects of Democratic rhetoric in the South. The Negro Supremacy campaign's slogan was a call to violence, and the election season in 1868 witnessed anti-black terrorism in the South on a massive scale. The Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist organizations, which were functioning essentially as a paramilitary arm of the Democratic Party, systematically terrorized black communities in order to suppress voter turnout. As the historian Kadada E. Williams has written, soldiers in the expanding shadow army attacked and assassinated black voters and their white allies using the same tactics, that is to say, systemic violence, that enslavers had. Thousands of political murders were committed in Louisiana alone during the 1868 campaign season. The black abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who had long served as the moral conscience of the Republican Party, led the way in evoking for voters the solemn character of the crisis, as he put it in an August 1868 speech. "The South today is a field of blood," he declared. Armed bands of rebels stalk abroad at midnight and go forth to shoot and stab and murder their loyal neighbors. As Douglass knew better than anyone, the Democrats' campaign slogan of Negro supremacy created a discursive minefield for African Americans, one that could be navigated only with extreme care. Ever since the emergence of Black abolitionism in the North, going back to the 1820s, Black activists had had to pull off a difficult rhetorical balancing act. They were keenly aware that anti-abolitionists equated Black freedom with anarchy and race war. And so Black activists like David Walker and his allies argued that slavery and not abolition, slavery was the source of danger and strife in America, and that abolition would bring peace and prosperity if whites would only meet Blacks halfway. At the same time, Black activists asserted their right to use force to defend themselves as a last resort. During the Civil War, when Confederates designated Black Union soldiers as insurrectionists and enslaved or executed them summarily, Black activists countered that Black soldiers were agents of the state who used legitimate violence, force against white rebels, and who showed remarkable forbearance in refraining from acts of vengeance against their former tormentors. From the start of Reconstruction, Black activists warned that the discourse of Negro supremacy was a malevolent scheme to turn back the clock. Our opponents here raised the cry of Negro supremacy, the Afro-Creole New Orleans Tribune intoned in 1867, but they are fostering white supremacy by all and every means as the first step in the attempt to reestablish slavery. As the Black newspaper The Elevator lamented in 1868, quote, "Every justifiable resistance on the part of Blacks against abuse is heralded as a Negro outrage. Every assertion of right is set down as Negro supremacy. Every claim for justice, a desire to rule." Now, Black commentators did, in their own distinct ways, they had to disavow any desire for racial supremacy. But they did so not in order to reassure whites, but instead to establish the legitimacy of their own rights claims. As the Reverend J.B. Sanderson declared in an 1868 speech, Blacks had no aspiration to become the dominant and governing class. What they wanted, as he put it, was an equal chance in this race, to live on their native soil with their rights acknowledged alongside their countrymen of every hue and nationality, as he put it. Any suggestion otherwise, Sanderson charged, was a barefaced and hollow slander. Black activists countered such slanders by contrasting their own patriotism with white Southern faithlessness. At an 1868 commemoration in Kansas of the 1st of August anniversary of British abolition in the West Indies, the speaker there, W.M. Twine, looked forward to the pending 1868 presidential election and declared that the Republican Party sought not Negro supremacy, but loyal supremacy, to put Union men in power, in order that this flag that waves over our heads today, the mighty emblem of liberty, may wave over that vast dominion of fertile lands of the South, as he put it. He went on, "We have shown our fidelity to this, our common country. The colored men of the country helped to carry the Star-Spangled Banner to the states where it had been degraded." Here was a constellation of images of Black men as liberators and patriots, dispensers of justice, that transcended the temporizing rhetoric of white Republicans. In sum, while Democratic campaign rhetoric relentlessly sounded alarms about so-called Black rule, Republican responses ran a gamut from glib dismissals to sober denunciations, and those responses reflected the range of stakeholders in the party. So what was the result of these debates on the way ballots were actually cast? Well, on the face of it, in 1868, the U.S. Grant won a commanding victory. He garnered 214 electoral votes to Horatio Seymour's 80. But a close look at these results reveals how much damage the Democrats' campaign had already done to Reconstruction. Black votes helped provide Grant his margin in some of the reconstructing southern states, but in a sign of things to come, Seymour won 2 Deep South states, Louisiana and Georgia, in which anti-Black violence, the suppressing of the vote, was the deciding factor. Republicans wondered out loud in the aftermath of the election about whether the Democrats would persist in trying to stoke racial fears or whether they were chastened by defeat. Are people really afraid of Negro supremacy, Harper's Weekly asked in November of 1868, or is it the mere catcall of a canvass, electioneering? The staying power of supremacy discourse and its adaptability soon became evident. In the next election cycles, state-level elections, 1869 to 1871, for choosing things like the congressmen and governors and state legislators, Democrats replaced Negro supremacy with white supremacy as their main catchphrase. And to understand why, we have to return to the Republican Party's outlook and policies. In February of 1869, just a few months after Grant's victory at the polls, the U.S. Congress passed the 15th Amendment to the Constitution and submitted it to the states for ratification. That amendment, which Grant endorsed, prohibited the federal government and state governments from depriving any citizen of the right to vote on racial grounds. Republicans regarded the amendment as necessary to counter the Democrats' voter suppression and also to enfranchise Northern blacks. Congress took additional steps. It soon passed a series of enforcement acts that set penalties for interfering with voting rights, that criminalized the Ku Klux Klan and other such terrorist groups. Congress had seemingly taken to heart Frederick Douglass's observation that slavery is not abolished until the black man has the ballot. And yet, ominously, the Democratic Party moved quickly to seize victory from the jaws of defeat. Democrats cast the 15th Amendment as the beginning of the end of Republican rule. And the essence of this argument was that Republicans, in mandating black enfranchisement throughout the nation by constitutional amendment, had overreached, and that opposition to black voting would now galvanize white voters across the country. The Democratic press literally nailed white supremacy to the masthead of the party, as one newspaper put it, and rallied voters with the promise that the days of mongrel despotism were numbered. The tide is now turning, a Democratic paper in Alabama declared in May of 1870 in what was a typical formulation. The passage of the 15th Amendment seems at last to have awakened the country. Notably, Democrats didn't seek to manipulate black votes. Instead, they categorically scorned any black political participation. A Mississippi Democratic club resolved that, quote, since Negro suffrage is wrong in principle and disastrous in effect, we covenant that we will not endeavor to obtain Negro votes at any election, and we will not support any candidate who does. As they had in 1868, Democratic papers continued in these off-year elections to expressly incite violence. A widely circulated Lexington, Missouri paper called the Weekly Caucasian, which advertised itself as the champion of white supremacy, hissed that revolution must be met by counter-revolution and usurpation should be overthrown, if need be, by the bayonet. This campaign strategy brought results, alas, for the Democrats. The number of Democratic seats in the U.S. House of Representatives rose dramatically in 1870 and 71, while Republican majorities were reduced or overturned in many states. The Democrats attributed their gains to their message discipline. White supremacy triumphant, declared an Ohio paper when reporting in June of 1870 on Democratic victories, while a South Carolina paper attributed the Democrats' gains to the fact that their candidates spurned the Negro vote and asked only the suffrages of white men. Republicans marveled at how every Democratic newspaper waved the banner now of white supremacy. But once again, Republicans were divided over how to respond. Too many white Republicans dismissed the inflammatory rhetoric of the Democrats as the ravings of madmen who sought to produce a sensation but were not likely to do any great harm, as one Republican paper put it. Too few white Republicans fully recognized the concept, the construct of white supremacy as a slogan for the lethal weapon that it was. All told, the elections between 1869 and 1871 resulted in the so-called redemption, as white Southern Democrats put it, of 4 Southern states, Virginia, Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina. The Democrats overthrew the Republican governments there. Reconstruction wasn't yet over, but the tide was indeed turning. One after another Southern state toppled congressional Reconstruction. Northerners capitulated, and in 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes, a moderate Republican president, withdrew the remaining federal troops from the South, thus effectively ending Reconstruction. Anti-Black terrorism and voter suppression, more than any other factors, changed the electoral map in the way I've just described, drove the Republicans from the South. But propaganda played its part. Words mattered. As I've shown, in the 5-year period from 1867 to 1871, discourses of racial supremacy took root in American politics as hallmarks of Democratic Party campaigns. A template was thus set, a pattern established. Both terms, Negro supremacy and white supremacy, persisted in the ensuing decades and were deployed in tandem by Democrats to win office and crush nascent third-party movements and impose one-party rule and Jim Crow segregation on the South. After Reconstruction ended, the central rhetorical role of Negro supremacy in democratic discourse was as a device of history to stigmatize congressional Reconstruction as a failure and thus preempt any further intervention by the federal government in Southern affairs. In the Jim Crow era, white Southerners relentlessly pressed the case that congressional Reconstruction had been a, quote, great crime against humanity, unquote, as the Southern politician Wade Hampton put it in an 1888 essay entitled What Negro Supremacy Means. His home state of South Carolina, Hampton claimed, had been prostrated during Reconstruction by 8 years of Negro domination. The fact that this was, again, demonstrably untrue was immaterial to Southerners like Hampton and to legions of white Northerners who enthusiastically consumed the image of Reconstruction as a tragic era of Black rule. As they had all along, Black activists and intellectuals tried to set the record straight. Hampton's essay, for example, was responded to directly by a fearless journalist named John Edward Bruce, who protested that, quote, the whole truth of history and the records of those times will show that Hampton's deductions and conclusions are terribly inaccurate. Frederick Douglass, for his part, offered his own history lesson, looking back on the early years of Reconstruction from the vantage point of the 1890s. There have been, Douglass explained, 3 distinct periods of persecution of Negroes in the South, I'm quoting him, and 3 distinct sets of excuses or pretexts for persecution. This in his 1894 speech, The Lessons of the Hour. The first excuse in the antebellum era was the fear of slave insurrection. The second, during Reconstruction, was the fear of Negro supremacy. And the third pretext for white violence, Douglass explained, in the aftermath of Reconstruction, was the fabricated myth of Black men's assault of white women. Words are things, Douglass noted. I'm quoting him, words are things. He marveled at how white Southerners used the old trick of misnaming, as he put it, to occlude the real cause of Southern disorder. What whites misleadingly called the Negro problem was really the problem of white racism. The only solution to that problem, Douglass asserted, striking a note of hope in this, his last major speech before he died, was for whites to, quote, conquer their prejudices and cultivate kindness and humanity. Despite countless such efforts to establish counter-narratives, the tragic era interpretation of Reconstruction only gained power, a power manifest not only in American politics, but in American culture too, as evidenced by the popularity of films such as Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind that trafficked in all of this kind of propaganda. Meanwhile, white supremacy as a political slogan supplanted Negro supremacy in its ubiquity and its influence. White supremacy continued as a phrase to mark moments of democratic victory in the project of suppressing Black politics. References to white supremacy spiked in years like 1874 and 1890 when Democrats won big gains in Congress. As the 2 major parties shifted gears and positions over the course of the 20th century, the phrase white supremacy remained a stock in trade of opponents of Black civil rights, and its usage spiked again during the 1960s debates over voting rights. Over time, Americans came to define white supremacy expansively, to use it as a sort of general synonym for structural racism, and as a fitting label for white nationalists like Donald Trump. Understandably, Americans have been more interested in the ontological question of who can be classified as a white supremacist than they have in the question of how that label originated. I have tried to show here tonight that white supremacy as a linguistic construct was not a timeless, perennial feature of American politics, but instead the product of a particular moment. During the slavery era, whites had conceptualized the racial order as an immutable, divinely ordained hierarchy, and they had cast challenges to that order as unnatural anomalies and aberrations. After emancipation, when whites were asked to share power and opportunity with the freed people, whites recast race relations as a relentless, existential, brutal contest for supremacy. So ultimately, and I'll wrap up now, ultimately, why does it matter to know this? What implications does this exercise in etymology have for our broad understanding of modern history? Well, let me first address the nature of Reconstruction. Historians have fiercely debated a series of questions about that fraught period. How progressive was the Republican Party really? Was Reconstruction a transformative second founding for the United States, or was it a much more limited program of reunion? Did Reconstruction ever really have a chance? I've tried to point up, by analyzing supremacy discourse, the limits of Republican progressivism and of Reconstruction's scope and of its chances for success. Democrats were the era's reactionaries, but Republicans were too often reactive, on the tactical defensive rhetorically, as the Democrats set the terms of the era's ideological combat. White Republicans, I have argued, acquiesced to a striking degree in the Democrats' setting of terms. But black activists, too, were caught in the Democrats' discursive trap, no matter how mightily they tried to break free. The historian Mia Bay, in her landmark intellectual history, The White Image and the Black Mind, published in 2000, has illuminated how the dominant discourse of race in America has worked to constrain challenges to racism's audacious fiction, as she puts it. Generations of black intellectuals, she has shown, denounced race as a fallacy, but could not break free discursively from the premises of hierarchy and difference. They countered white racism by offering images of blacks as a virtuous redeemer race, morally superior to brutal and aggressive whites. And thus, in a sense, as Bay puts it, they remained beholden to hierarchical thinking. It was so hard to break free of that trap. The advent of a language of supremacy, I've suggested tonight, imposed its own additional constraints on what could be thought and what could be said. The Democrats' use of the term Negro supremacy forced Republicans, white and black, to disavow any desire or any aspirations or plans for black political power. Those disavowals came relatively easily to white Republicans who were ambivalent at best about black office holding, but they came at a terribly high price to black activists who simply were not permitted to build the case for their political fitness or to give voice fully to their ambitions and dreams. Ultimately, the discourse of racial supremacy is best understood as a new and extreme form of an old argument, the idea that any gains for blacks would endanger and subtract from the freedoms of whites. Over the decades and indeed centuries, egalitarian reformers, with black activists always in the vanguard, have tried to break the spell of zero-sum game thinking, only to be met at every phase of the freedom struggle with backlash from their enemies and backsliding from their erstwhile allies. I'll end my lecture with one recent example. Our Supreme Court ruled this year that race-conscious affirmative action college admissions policies to promote the inclusion of minority applicants were unconstitutional. The court thus struck a blow at universities' programs of diversity and equity. History was on trial in this recent Supreme Court case. The majority opinion and the dissenting opinion alike of the justices turned on interpretations of the 14th Amendment, passed during Reconstruction in 1868 to accord the equal protection of the law to formerly enslaved Southerners. Both sides in this modern affirmative action debate tried to divine the intentions of the 14th Amendment's framers, namely the very white Republicans about whom I've been talking today. Opponents of affirmative action, led by Justice Clarence Thomas, argue that the 14th Amendment, in one fell swoop, rendered the U.S. Constitution colorblind and thus prohibited any further race-based class legislation or policy such as affirmative action. Echoing, of all people, Andrew Johnson, Thomas insists that race relations is indeed a zero-sum game, that you cannot help a college applicant of one race in this instance without injuring the an applicant of a different race. Supporters of affirmative action, represented by Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, insist instead that the 14th Amendment initiated a still unfinished, ongoing, multi-generational project of fulfilling the ideal of equality through continued legislation and policymaking and jurisprudence. Rejecting Thomas's zero-sum game lingo, she makes the case that campus diversity benefits all students. Our close look at Reconstruction reveals that Ketanji Brown Jackson's interpretation is the historically accurate one. With their discourses of racial supremacy, Democrats had boldly announced their defiance of the Reconstruction amendments and their wholesale rejection of change. And in the face of that hostility, Republicans necessarily played the long game. They had to. They understood perfectly well that they were embarking on a multi-generational project that was facing terrible headwinds, and that's why the 14th Amendment was followed by a 15th Amendment and by the Enforcement Acts and so on. Revealingly, Ketanji Brown Jackson's dissent in this very disturbing Supreme Court opinion echoes Frederick Douglass in emphasizing the power of language. The forces of reaction still rely on the old trick of misnaming things. Declaring America to be colorblind, Jackson protests, does not make it so. She echoes Douglass, too, in her prescription for progress, one that pushes back forcefully but carefully at the discursive box of difference and hierarchy and supremacy. She writes, "The only way out of this morass for all of us is to stare at racial disparity unblinkingly and then do what evidence and experts tell us is required to level the playing field and march forward together, collectively striving to achieve true equality for all Americans." Words matter. We can't rewrite the origin story of white supremacy, but we can strive to find a language for addressing America's racism problem that transcends the restrictive slogans of the past. Thank you.